In the current context of global economic and public health crisis, we are facing an unprecedented world with new problems, new players, and new challenges. We clearly understand that a reconsideration of strategies and a review of policies is necessary. The current data and news invites pessimism, at least in the short term. The death tolls weakness the GDP, real unemployment, investment losses, public deficits, commercial and private debt, bankruptcies, and illiberal wins, among other issues, are part of our daily concerns. In this context, and I hope you agree with me, we must be optimistic and be ready to work for the future. And so let's start with this discussion on the topic recovery on the world economy after the pandemic. No? Ms. Gonzalez, more integration. No? We talk about Europe, we need to talk about more integration. The EU economy has been hit very hard by the pandemic. Despite some first nationalistic reactions of several member states, we are glad to see how they have agreed to show the required solidarity for putting together an ambitious recovery package. Is this an encouraging sign for the process of closer integration in the future?
Well, I think that obviously the agreement on the recovery fund is a good signal, but I think that we should not lose perspective on what it means. It was just simply coming together under very extreme circumstances in an emergency moment. So I think that it could be very difficult to extrapolate that goodwill that was found in that particular moment into whether there is any wish for any further European integration. From my point of view, I think that any meaningful attempts towards further integration in Europe are unlikely, and they are unlikely because of three things, basically. Because we are still divided on the north-south divide and bridge there, and I think that we have to be very realistic in Spain that might require, bridging that gap might require a little bit more of a mature approach towards public spending, to put it very diplomatically, I think, from some of our countries. There is a very big divide in terms of how we see the key powers around the world, certainly in relation to China, in relation to Russia, and depending who is the winner of the US election, it could be also in relation to the US if Trump continues there, which I think that is unlikely. And we are also divided in terms of the values. That to me is the biggest worry of it all. And we tend to forget that in relation to some countries, in particular in Eastern Europe, we have a real gap there in terms of values and democratic vision, etc. So I think that in that context, it is going to be very difficult to go for further integration. I also think that we should not lose track of the fact that the nationalism is not a threat that has disappeared. We have seen a little bit of a change of the wave. I think in particular in Germany and in countries like Italy. And Eric will know much more than me about this. Certainly in France, it is still a concern, and what would happen in the next French elections, I think it is of fundamental importance to the European Union. And I think that we should be also very careful that the threat of nationalism is not replacing Europe by European nationalism. And one of the latest trends that we have seen, which is the Europe first, in that the words that we have seen, for example, coming from Charles Michel in the European Council, talking much more about European products, European first, what we are seeing in the digital world on data sovereignty in Europe, even some of the decisions on the competition field going back to defending some monopolies. I think that is an area that we have to watch very carefully. But just to summarize, I do not think that we are in the mood in Europe for further integration. I think that we are in in a survival defensive mode, possibly survival mode if Trump is elected, but definitely defensive mode, and we have to be very realistic on where we are if we want to continue making progress.
So perhaps more interested, but also Europe in different speeds, Prime Minister Passos. No? The EU recovery package is ambitious, but not all the member states are in the same position to take advantage of the funds. GDP compositions are different, and also the capacity to invest with diverse fiscal spaces and relaxed state rules. Recovery will take place at different speeds, and probably we may come out of this crisis with less fair competition in our internal market. Will this legacy of the crisis be a real danger?
Well, the answer is no one knows exactly. There are some dangers in the way that most part of the countries deal with the crisis, because, as you said, there is different space for fiscal activism among the different countries. They were not affected in the same way, not only because they had different background on the debt GDP ratio or fiscal policy, but because in the composition of GDP, some of them at the south were more exposed to the touristic sector, so they were more affected than the countries at the north. But of course, the way as the different countries responded, I'm not looking at the EU recovery plan and the resilient plan. I'm talking about national policies. They have, for instance, presented different fiscal answers. No one can present a big rivalry against Germany. Why? Because they spend it by their own almost 50% of all state aids inside of the European Union. So probably at the end of the day, the EU internal market will be more German than French or Spanish or so on. It's most probably the main result. But there are also other differences. For instance, we can see again that most part of the most affected countries share among them some peripheral situation regarding the EU core countries. And after 30 years of the Euro experience, divergence is now more important than 30 years ago. The countries had a common past in the European monetary system, but they don't profit at the same way sharing the experience of the euro. So after the legacy of the previous crisis, we are now more fragile than we were at the beginning of the euro 30 years ago. You see, when Mr. Draghi said in 2012, whatever it takes to spare Spain, but more concern about the Italy situation, the result was fantastic. For sure, Italy could avoid a very difficult situation, but Italy is now more vulnerable than in 2012. And the euro presented different mechanisms to deal with the crisis. We are now a more perfect and a more complete monetary union, but we are not a fully monetary union. And now we don't have the problems only with Italy. We look at the French situation and we see German, for instance, could present now a GDP debt to GDP ratio around 62 or 63% after dealing with a very strong fiscal stimulus to the economy. But France has another championate because they are above 112, 13% of GDP. So we will need to deal with these vulnerabilities because of the new level, the new threshold for GDP recovery pace, for the new GDP debt to GDP ratio, because we don't have the most successful economic integration among the North and the South countries, because the meaning of complete EMU represent for most part of the people creating a fiscal union and maybe a common government to deal with the fiscal union. But that's not an academic question. It's a political question. And as my colleague said just now, most part of the countries face nationalist reactions against more integration. So there are positive things that can be an important element to reinforce the new elements of the integration we have achieved already until now. But there are some menaces, certain aspects that defy political cohesion and economic integration.
Well, more or less integration, with nationalism always lurking around the corner. The need to deal with some vulnerabilities, but more or less interdependence. No, this is the other element. No, Mr. Lamont-Spinoza, in the past decades, we have reached an unprecedented level of interdependence in the world. Our societies are closer than ever. Even before the pandemic, you wrote that we cannot manage global risks because we don't have global instruments. As we said yesterday, have we reached the ceiling of international cooperation, globalization, and multilateralism? Will the legacy of this crisis be one of more interdependence or less?
Well, first of all, my thanks to the Fundación Rafael del Pino and to the Círculo de Empresarios for inviting me to share with you a few ideas and comments. No? As we all know, in terms of analyzing the consequences of the pandemic, we now have at least two major schools of thought, as usual, two. One says that the pandemic is going to be a game changer. Kissinger, for example, has sustained this idea. Nothing is going to be the same in the future. Another, which for me is more reliable, sustained, for example, by Richard Haas, sustains that the pandemic is more an accelerator of previous trends. And I think that's more reliable. No? It's an accelerator. But however, quantitative changes may lead to qualitative changes. And I think that the pandemic is an accelerator of a major historic trend, which is the moving from a Western-centric, Eurocentric world order to a more Asian-ordered world. Which is, for me, is crucial, if only for demographic reasons. As we know, Asia is now 60% of the world population, Europe is 7%, 8%, the United States little less. Latin America, we consider Latin America part of the West, which is debatable. Latin America will be another 7%. So that's the question. The situation before the pandemic was quite clear: an increasing number of global problems, the pandemic, climate change, terrorism, demographic poverty, etc., but with a very poor response in terms of multilateral solution. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said a few weeks ago that we have a surplus of global problems, but a major deficit when it comes to multilateral solutions. Indeed, globalization and weak global governance have gone hand in hand. And this is probably, as you pointed before, at least to me, the major problem of our time, which is lack of global governance. For example, the failure of the World Health Organization has been very important in terms of the dealing with the pandemic. What will happen during or after the pandemic? Well, we can see what's happening already, which is indeed more of that. Societies everywhere have retreated under the protection of their states like a snail hiding inside its cell. Fear produces such reactions, looking for protection under known umbrellas, be it the family or the home. There has been a kind of cocooning of societies all over the world, or the state immediately after. Add the economic consequences. Global trade has plummeted. FDI has fallen. International society is becoming probably more than ever a Westphalian order of sovereign states. I think that we are witnessing a re-statalization of the world, the national world and the international world, both of them. For example, a recent report, very important, by Freedom House, the American ONG that monitors the state of democracy in the world, a report called Democracy Under Lockdown, shows that a combination of states of emergency or exception, a growing state interference in the economies, and on the other side, an atomized and fragmented civil society, living in fear, lacking cohesion due to the lockdown, is harming the quality of democracy throughout the world, resulting in increased illiberalism. More than 80 countries, 80 states, according to Freedom House, have suffered recently from restrictions of freedoms and the rule of law. I'm very much concerned with that, and I think we are witnessing a return of new wave of authoritarianism. This was already happening before the pandemic for 14 years at least, after the brilliant third wave of democratization of the world, but has been reinforced by the pandemic itself. Of course, the increased role of the state means a smaller role for the international multilateral order. We see everywhere strong men in Russia, in China, in Turkey, who knows, in the United States, strong men but very weak institutions. Add the contrast between the poor response to the pandemic in the West, in Europe, in the United States, also in Latin America, and the much adequate response in the East that does not help indeed. I'm talking about the good response in China, in Japan, in South Korea. In a sense, collectivism is willing, individualism is reducing. No? What happens next? What happens with globalization? I don't know. We are now in the mist, and our lights won't allow us to see ahead. We don't know when the mist will lift. Economists call situation radical uncertainty, and I think we are in a radical uncertainty. The classic globalization of people, capital, and goods may return, although slowly and with changes. The economists noted in a report on the evolution of the globalization that globalization is down but not out. I think I can see at least four major trends affecting right now globalization. First, obviously, reshoring and nearshoring, perhaps the most obvious. Japan, for example, is spending a lot in bringing back factories to Japan. Second, increased diversification, with more countries contributing, less concentration. We have now more than 180 key commercialized products in which a single country accounts for more than 70% of world exports. This is not sustainable any longer. Third, globalization in the production of global goods, such as climate change and health, creating a pull factor for many new industries and services. And finally, digitalization and remote working will create a new globalization of services and intangible goods, and immaterial globalization that stands to benefit countries like India, in contrast to the classic world factories such as China. But let me insist, and I finish with that, with this idea of radical uncertainty. So I wouldn't rule out that all globalization may bounce back sharply. The economic logic of profit is still there and is going to continue. We don't know. For sure, we don't know. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this description of the scenario. And we add this element of a lack of global governance. Mr. Cheney, let's analyze the concept of the transfer union. No? As we said before, the European Union recovery package is ambitious and reinforces solidarity. But it looks that we move towards a transfer union. No? What are the challenges we face in that case, according to your opinion? You have muted your microphone? Yep. Sorry.
Here we go. Do you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you again for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor. I will speak in a personal capacity. I'm an economic advisor at Institut Montaigne, but I will give my own views. I would like to go back to 1990. At that time, I was not in the private sector. I was in the Ministry of Finance in Paris, and we were working very hard on the design of the monetary union. Everyone was working on this design. And the big debate among economists was, does it make sense to go for a single currency if there is a high risk of asymmetric shocks? So this is economic jargon, but you see what it means. A shock, supply side shock, for instance, which would hit one country and not another one. And this country would not have the ability to devalue its currency to cope with the productivity shock. And the answer at that time was, well, the probability of asymmetric shocks is low because in contrast with the US, all our economies are diversified. You don't have Detroit, which is making all the cars in the US. We are making cars in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in France, blah, blah, blah. And so now let me go to the present. We have had a lot of asymmetric shocks. Let me remind you, even before the EMU, the Asian crisis was a big asymmetric shock. It was hitting harder Germany than any other economies in Europe because, of course, Germany exporter, and for Germany, Asia is very important. And then we had 2008 with the contraction of global trade, which was 35%, a second asymmetric shock hitting Germany very hard. And then we had the Euro crisis hitting southern countries or the countries which had not managed to manage their public finances in a way that would restore confidence in the markets. And we have an even bigger asymmetric shock. I think this has already been mentioned, and it is perfectly true. The COVID crisis is hitting much harder southern countries, not because they are not well managed, but because they have sun. And with sun, you have tourism. We are not going to change that. Nobody's going to go to Germany for tourism instead of going in Italy or in Spain. Some countries are more specialized than others in aerospace industry. And we might have a permanent shock on the aerospace industry if post-COVID, people just travel less than before. Even if it is a 5% shock, it's big. So we have, I would say, the mother of all asymmetric shocks. And I'm talking not about a demand shock, I'm talking about a supply side shock. There will be sectors that will be probably smaller than they were before the crisis. Tourism is one of them, aerospace, air transportation. There are other sectors which are benefiting from the crisis. So what are the consequences of this asymmetric shock? It's a great, I think, thing that we have managed to build this 750 billion. The European Commission tells us it's 1 trillion euros recovery fund. If you add up everything, that's great. But you have noticed that this was done within the multi-annual fiscal framework, the so-called MFF of the European Union, which means that some countries will benefit more than others, but all that money will have to be paid back over 15, 20 years. And here is the most important point, in my view, which has been much less commented than the size of the fund. We have a change in the net contributors' countries. Italy was a net contributor. Italy is becoming now a net receiver. Spain was a net receiver, will be even more a net receiver. France was a net contributor, remains a net contributor, but much less than before. And of course, Germany, which was a net contributor, will become a much bigger net contributor. So here we are. We have the transfer union. It was accepted by the contributors. That was accepted by Germany, not only because of solidarity, but because it was a condition to the cohesion of the European Union and the Eurozone. So this raises a lot of questions. Will that be accepted over time by the constituencies, so the voters of each country? And I insist on each country because there is a political issue, both on the side of countries which are contributing. Am I going to pay money, if I am a German taxpayer, to help countries which are not able to do what they should do? But also on the receiving side, because of course, with these transfers will unavoidably come a pressure to have some controls on the way the money is spent. Whether the control comes from the European Commission, from the peer countries, I do not know. So this raises a big issue, and I think it's good. It's good to look at it straight in the eyes. There will be controls, checks and controls coming with this solidarity. If we don't accept this, then we are doomed. A transfer union, which is a consequence of this asymmetric shock, which nobody had seen coming, will imply the acceptability of some form of checks and controls. So I'm not going to elaborate on this political issue, but I think we should be aware of that and aware of the fact that it is on both sides. And then you have the question of how to adapt to a supply side shock. And here, we don't know exactly what will be the size of the supply side shock. We have an idea, a qualitative idea, tourism, aerospace, but we know that there will be this big supply side shock. Independently from the transfers, there will be the question of the flexibility of each economy to adapt to this asymmetric shock. Let me take the example of the Eurozone crisis. Some countries which were in trouble, and Spain was one of them, did much better than others. And Spain is the good example, together with Ireland, of a country which managed to transform its economy to become more flexible and to benefit from the transfers that came in the form of loans from the other countries. Some countries did not do the job, were less flexible, and are left with a lower level of productivity. So this question will be absolutely crucial. Which degree of flexibility will allow countries to cope with the asymmetric shock? One area where I think it is very urgent to make progress is to have a deeper integration in terms of capital union. I'm talking about the financial markets, I'm talking about the allocation of savings. If there is an asymmetric shock, there will be sectors benefiting from it. There will be sectors that will diminish over time. So we need to have a reallocation, not only of the labor force, this is a national question, but a reallocation of funding. And to have that, we need a banking union. We need countries accepting what is called property transfers, but this is simply a reallocation of capital. And we need to go further in the banking union. To move further in the resolution process of banks will be of utmost importance after the end of the COVID crisis, which is going to leave banks in a worse shape in as much as they have lent to companies which will go bankrupt. So big challenges, but also a big opportunity to smartly go deeper into European integration, even though it is a form of transfer union.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. Very, very interesting concept, the concept of transfer union, when we talk about the nature of the union. So we will come back on the questions of conditionality, solidarity at the end of the session. But welcome, Professor Wolf. We all have these technical problems in these connections from around the world. So we can continue with your with a question for you. No. On digitalization and technological disruption, the US and China are competing for international leadership in technology, while the EU is running behind. We in Europe are, however, leaders in climate change policies. Digitalization and climate are two key safe and strategic bets for the future. Will we be able to keep our leadership in climate change while catching up in technology? What do you think about?
Well, first of all, thank you again for the invitation, and I'm very sorry I had some technical issues at the beginning, but it's a great pleasure to be here and talk to you about these very important topics. I really thought I would make three quick observations. The first quickly related to the pandemic and where we are. The second to the EU Recovery Fund. And the third, more specifically, to the issue that you just raised, which is digitalization and the Green Deal, because I think all of them, and of course, how this all interacts with the US elections. So let me be very quick on the first 2 points, because I'm sure a lot of this has already been covered, and focus on the third one. But quickly on the first 2 points, I think it is a very important moment in the pandemic, which we all have to think very deeply about and think very carefully about, because we are entering a second wave of a lockdown. And if we continue with the current strategy, we are going to have this W-shape recession stop and go policy where, we stop the economy because of lockdowns of the pandemic, and then we restart it again, and then we stop it again because always there is, so to speak, a hope that the virus is contained, and if we open too early and too long, the virus spreads, and even if you do too little lockdowns, individuals and companies will hold back with their investment and with their consumption. So I really think there's a real risk here that this will entail very big and very long-lasting damage to the economy. And we cannot just continue hoping that a vaccine will solve it. The vaccine may come very soon, but it may also not come so soon. It may take a long time. And if we are unlucky, the vaccine may actually not be even good enough to really fully overcome the situation. So I really think the first duty of policymakers at this stage is think more about how to contain the pandemic. Tracing apps, contact and tracing apps need to be further enhanced. We also need to enhance, fast testing capacities, so that when we go for Christmas to see our grandparents or our parents, we actually can do the test before we see them. So these things need to be really developed and need to advance in parallel. And if I can add the 1 point here, there is a big discussion on privacy rights when it comes to these apps. And I'm a big fan of privacy rights and of fundamental rights, but I also note that we are restricting a lot of fundamental rights currently with the lockdowns, while we do not want to touch any of the privacy fundamental rights. And I think there is a societal need to debate the right balance between privacy rights and the other fundamental rights that are being infringed and being violated by and restricted by basically our lockdown policies. So I think that's the first big debate. And if we can't solve this issue, I think we are in for a lot of economic pain, but also societal pain for quite a long period. The second point is quickly on the EU Recovery Fund, and I'm sure you discussed that a lot already. The EU Recovery Fund really is a milestone. It's a breakthrough. It's really a completely puts us on a completely new setup of Europe's monetary union. Now, if you want this to be something that is more than just a one-off, but something that structurally changes the way the European Union and especially Europe's monetary union operates, meaning if we want to reuse this whenever there's a big second crisis, we will need to get the governance mechanisms right. And I just read that actually today there seems to be a breakthrough, an agreement on the rule of law mechanism. I haven't read that one yet, but I think it is absolutely fundamental that there is a strong rule of law mechanism, that there's a strong administrative and political accountability, so that money that is jointly borrowed, which is EU money, is well spent. If the narrative sets in that money is not well spent, EU money is not well spent, EU money is wasted, the political support for repeating this in the future will be very, very small. So I think really thinking about good governance, making sure that money is well spent, is absolutely crucial and absolutely fundamental. And let me then come quickly to the third point, which is the one that you raised, and which is really about Europe in the middle between China and the US, and technology and the Green Deal. And it really seems to me, I mean, the first, I think, important point is why has Germany shifted on the EU Recovery Fund? Well, I think one reason why it has shifted, I mean, there were three reasons, it seems to me, but one reason is indeed related to the global environment. The second reason, in my opinion, it was that the pandemic really was a dramatic situation, an outstanding situation. And the third reason was the decision of the German Constitutional Court on the ECB's quantitative easing program. All three, I think, have galvanized and focused minds in Berlin, and have made, I think, for a very substantial shift in the German policy position on the EU Recovery Fund. So what is really the worry on the international scene? Well, I think, as many of us have written for a long time, it is on the one hand China, but it is on the other hand, of course, the United States. And I think if I want to emphasize one point from one lesson that I would take away from the US election, that we are all continuing to follow here on our screens. I mean, I think even now that it seems that Biden will become the president, I mean, okay, or at least has won the vote. Let's see whether he becomes the president. I hope so. The lesson really is that the United States is an extremely divided country. And that does not only mean that it is inward-looking, going to be inward-looking and trying to heal its own problems, but it also means that we can't rely on them as a reliable partner in the future. I mean, why wouldn't in 4 years another populist president win the popular vote? So this notion that just because Biden has won, we can sort of go back to the good old transatlantic times. I think this notion is just wrong. I mean, the United States as a country is not the country we thought it was. And it's not that there was a blue landslide victory. It is really a 50-50 victory at the end of the day. So I'm actually quite concerned about the US and the stability of the US and the reliability of the US as a long-term partner. And I think that really plays out and has major implications in basically many fields. It has implications in trade, but it also has implications. It also has implications in when it comes to when it comes to technology and to trade technology and to green policies. And so let's just talk 1 minute about the technology and the green space. So I think in the technology space, Biden president, as much as a Trump president, will continue to pursue the technology trade war with the United States, with China. So the gap in digital technologies and the attempt to decouple technology-wise between the US and China will continue, and that has very severe consequences for European companies, because European companies are on both sides heavily invested and depend in the value chains on technologies from China and from the United States. And so rethinking how we can get our technological sovereignty, I think, is really important. So this space is I think one of the most interesting and important policy spots to be watched in the next 1 or 2 years. And of course, I'm also working on a paper, but the paper isn't finished, so I can't say much about that paper yet. But I think it really is a crucial topic. And the second is the Green Deal. Of course, the Green Deal is a major EU initiative, but it is an initiative that has foreign policy implications. It has implications for our relations with China, for our relations with the United States, and for our relations with our neighborhood. And when it comes to the US, and since I mentioned the US election, I had hoped for a strong Biden win and Democratic win also in the parliament that would have allowed to push through a Green Deal together with the United States and agree jointly on the very toxic theme of border carbon adjustment. Border carbon adjustment being absolutely crucial to prevent essentially the leakage of carbon-intensive production to outside of the EU. With the US Congress in the hands, or Senate in the hands of the Republicans, US President Biden will not be able to sign an agreement in that direction with the European Union. And so it means for the European Union to make a choice. Do we do a Green Deal without border carbon adjustment? Or do we do a Green Deal with border carbon adjustment and facing strongly opposing consequences from the United States? So I think pushing through our Green Deal has just become a lot more difficult, especially if the Senate is won by the Republicans. So perhaps on this not so optimistic note, let me stop here and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. We know that Bruegel is being very active in analyzing the recovery strategy of the EU in this complex scenario that we face. No? Thank you very much. We will come back at the end of the session to these questions. Let's continue, and we move now to Britain. No? And of course, Ms. Gonzalez, no? The questions on Britain are always for you. Let's talk about the impact of Brexit. The prospects for a negotiated agreement with the EU after Brexit are not good, really. We move probably towards a hard Brexit. No? How big will be the impact in the European construction process of this situation? Do you believe that it will allow the EU27 to speed up integration, or on the contrary, it sets a risky precedent to be followed by others in the future?
As you rightly say, the prospects of a soft Brexit are not good. I personally think that we are going to have a deal, and if you look at the situation of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister, he's at his very weakest since he was elected. So he does need to come up with something, some form of agreement. But it has been very clear already for a long time that that kind of agreement would be what we call in jargon skinny agreement, so a very basic agreement, which is nowhere near the kind of relation that we have with the UK right now in Europe. Things change a little bit depending on who is the elected president of the United States. I think that if Trump becomes the president, which is very unlikely, in that case, Boris Johnson has a bit more margin of maneuver to try to pivot the country from the sphere of influence of the European Union into being much closer to the US, with many costs and difficulties, but basically that could be one of the strategies. If Biden ends up being the president, and from what I see, I hear in Palo Alto speaking, but the latest news I see is that he's increasing a bit the margin in Nevada, so hopefully that may be the result. But if Biden is elected, I think that then we will see Boris Johnson in the coming weeks, even before Biden takes over, flexibilizing a bit, making more flexible his approach to the negotiations. And I have to say, perhaps starting a little bit the debate, that I do not really share so much that view that Biden will not change much in terms of the transatlantic relationship. I think that for Biden, Europe is the natural ally, that it is true that he will continue having the focus mostly on China, but at the end of the day, in all those ideas that he has on democracy, etc., there are not very many places where he could look for allies, and Europe is there. And frankly, I think that the fact that he does not have the Senate means that the only place where he will be able to make an imprint and to leave some legacy if he becomes president is on foreign affairs. So it may not be exactly what we like, and he may not go as far as we want, but I think that there are some positive grounds there. In any case, Brexit comes to us, to the European Union, at a moment of maximum difficulty, and it's easy for all of us to get lost in the details of recovery fund, this particular measure, but there are two very basic trends. One is that where we are moving in terms of the economy, the tech world, we are not there. The whole game is between the US and China, and that's where I am right now in Silicon Valley. That is seen very clearly. It is true that the EU is going to come up with some proposal that hopefully will be good, but that is about regulating trade. That is quite, regulating tech is quite different to trying to create market share on tech. And on top of that, we have another situation which is, again, quite perceived here in the US, that we could see China not being affected anymore by COVID, being able to eradicate COVID, the US being in a situation where it is not perceived that there is a second wave. So some states are going through a lot of difficulties, but here it is being perceived as a prolonged first phase, which is affecting a very big country at different paces, and may be able to link this to the beginning of the vaccine. And the second wave very much focusing in Europe. So in that moment of big difficulties, when we are getting the Brexit impact, and from my point of view, what we really need to do is to cut the losses. I think that we can deal with that pain of the implementation of Brexit, but we cannot deal with any other country going in the direction of the UK. And from my personal point of view, I think that in the negotiations with the UK, the rule has to be whatever helps France not being in 1 year and a half in the situation where the UK was in 2016. It is not worth upsetting the French fishermen for whatever, a little bit of flexibility in relation to the UK. It is not worth upsetting the French business community because we start flexibilizing what we do in the level playing field, etc., etc. So that, to me, should be the line in terms of the agreement. But we should not kid ourselves. The only way where we are going the UK and the EU is towards damaging each other. For the UK, the only strategy for this government has to be to show to its own citizens that they are better outside the European Union than inside the European Union. That is why they are rushing to do an agreement with Japan that they have done. In my view, where they are going is to try to become a member to what is called TP11, which is the Trans-Pacific agreements of Singapore, Canada, Mexico, Chile, etc., those kind of countries. And they need to demonstrate that they are better there with that flexibility and freedom than within the European Union. And for the European Union, we need to demonstrate that the UK was better within the European Union rather than outside. And that means proving that in terms of financial services, they will be worse off. That in terms of tech, they will be worse off. If the UK becomes a center of digital technology in Europe, that is a problem for the European Union. So I think that the prospect is rather grim. I think that to end in a bit more of a positive note, I think that there is a possibility to look at what is happening in the UK as a generational issue. In particular, taking into account the noises that we see from Scotland, which is a very big hot potato that we will have to deal with probably at some point. And preparing the ground for that generational discussion is something that the EU should not lose track of. So I think that the line should be being hard on the government, but being soft on the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. I think that we have to work hard to reinforce the narrative of the European integration process, of course, and we find a lot of obstacles in the way. Prime Minister Passos, reconsidering everything. No? The global scope and depth of this crisis should and will make us reconsider almost everything. The EU Growth and Stability Pact is suspended under reconsideration. We are also witnessing potential fundamental changes in the US monetary policy, and it is highly likely that the EU will introduce changes to its monetary policy as well. We have a lot of changes in front of us. Will these changes and others accelerate or impede the further development of the European integration process?
Well, as I said before, I think that it's not the most probable result to expect more integration at this time. But if we can, at the end of the day, to consolidate the integration process, that will be very good. You see, when the crisis came out to an end in 2014, we haven't already some of the permanent mechanisms to deal with crisis, financial crisis, among the monetary union. There is still some lack on the banking union, for instance. There is not a complete process on banking union, but almost complete. We will take more time, some more years to achieve truly financial union among the European Union, European countries. But I think we must be optimist regarding these kind of objectives. But I don't think that, for instance, the new resilient mechanism can be transformed on a permanent one. It's not probable that some kind of result could arrive. I must say that the division among North and South, core and peripheral countries has not been narrowed from in each crisis. Quite the opposite. We have more divergence and more differences now than at the beginning of the whole process. Professor Cheney was saying that maybe we can have a transfer union already with the new mechanisms. But we cannot forget that the multi-annual financial framework represents 1% of European GDP. So it's not a permanent transfer union. And the new mechanism to be permanent and to represent a fiscal permanent centralized answer against asymmetric shocks on the supply side, it's very improbable, because not only the four frugals would be against it, but the financial solution for a permanent mechanism would imply that more level of transfers would be needed for the future. After the Brexit, it's not probable that most part of the countries will agree on that. So, what can we expect because of the hour, the late hour we achieved already? I think that we can hope that the in-depth review of the monetary strategy policy of the ECB could bring some news. It's very convenient in a situation where in Europe and in most part of the developed countries we are near of a trap, as Mr. Keynes told us. That's a liquidity trap where the monetary policy is not effective at all. Monetary policy, mainly by the quantitative easing, is important to maintain solvency in indebtedness countries, but it's not already functioning to the aggregate demand, to stimulate aggregate demand. So it's important to achieve more degrees on efficiency for this kind of policy. There are several ways to do it, and to combine this to a different way to Stability and Growth Pact criterion to evaluate fiscal stance on the countries. I suppose that most part of the suggestions made, namely for the European Fiscal Board and other academic people, can be attained on the Eurogroup discussion. I wouldn't say that it will be easy for everyone to agree new rules, but it's very clear that the rules that we have are not effective, and they are not transparent. They are not helping us to achieve an European fiscal stance very appropriated. But if you ask me, can we deal with asymmetric shocks on the supply side better if we could have a permanent fiscal union? Maybe. I don't know. It depends if the shock is permanent or temporary. If it is temporary, flexibility doesn't solve any problem. Maybe some fiscal capacity could, absorbing this kind of shocks, could offer a different prospect. But there will be a political agreement to support this. I don't think so. It's when the academics discuss this kind of solutions, of course, in theoretical terms, we can always find the best answers. But the best answer, the optimal answer, must be coupled with a political possibility to support a solution. And I don't see for the next couple of years any political willingness to transfer taxes or public expense for the center of the EU. I don't see any possibility to have an European treasury issuing continuous debt to provide the necessary transfer for the regions more affected for asymmetric shocks. And the more important asymmetric shock that we can find a solution to deal with depends on the state nation. It's not conceivable that state nation would be erased for an European nation to solve this kind of asymmetry. So there is no possibility, in my opinion, to go further on the political union, in the political integration. And without political integration, we cannot manage a fiscal union or in a permanent and significant way issuing European debt. The European debt that is added now by this new mechanism will be supported by, I suppose, a double effort on the transference for the next 20 years, meaning that people must agree in the, not 1% of GDP transfers, but 2% of GDP transfers. If that is a fiscal union, well, it's not. It's not. So I'm not a pessimist because I think the crisis can bring us, like the previous crisis, new opportunities to consolidate the integration we achieved already, to put in order some kind of structural transformation. If the new funds can match structural transformation in digitalization, green transformation, that would be wonderful. Why? Because until now, the economic coordination among the countries do not deliver such kind of results. So that will be the new deliver or not. I don't know. It depends on the demands of the central decision in the Commission. But for instance, I cannot imagine Portugal that will be the recipient of 15 billion euros for the next 5 years, absorbing 15 billion euros in digitalization or in climate change. It's not possible. It will be not projects enough to spend the money. It's impossible. The government will transfer some part of these funds to current investment, the investment that was not exceeded by the necessity for the past 5 years to present a medium-term objective conciliable with the Stability and Growth Pact. I don't know, but the temptation is very big. So at the end of the day, we must be realistic. I wouldn't expect further integration, but I would expect more resilience among the countries after the pandemic shock. And I hope so, because Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden will put all the concerns, the North American concerns, on Asia and on China. Well, Mr. Trump is more color on that speech, but the problem of the North American economy is still there with Mr. Trump or with Mr. Biden. And for Europe, without the UK, will be more difficult to deal with this war, commercial war, economic war, financial war against China and against United States. When we look at the problem from the Asian side of the wall or in the North American side. So Europe must be more. They must agree on the necessity, on the need to bring more consensus among the countries. So it's expected to have more consensus against the foreign backdrop than the internal one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Prime Minister. Really, in this context of realism, I think that we need civic citizen engagement. No? Really, is important in order to reinforce the European project. Mr. Lamont Espinosa, we need a stronger and more united Europe in the new emerging bipolar scenario with the US and China and all these challenges that we are describing that we face. No? But EU citizens don't seem to be very enthusiastic about the integration process. No? Not only governments, no? Also the European citizens. No? How can we engage EU citizens, especially the younger generations, no? regarding the European project? Oh, you have muted the microphone, please. We can.
No, it's okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I was saying that since we are running out of time and I have to leave in about 10 minutes, I'll try to be short. No? I will skip some comments about the idea of a stronger and more united Europe outside, abroad. No? What we call in the jargon of Brussels, the strategic autonomy of the European Union. Just a comment, just a minor comment. We always talk about the Thucydides trap between the China and the US. We should talk about the trap between the European Union and the United States. As has been said before, and I agree fully, we cannot rely any longer on the security umbrella that the United States has provided us for many, many decades. But we have no alternative whatsoever to rely on this same umbrella. So we are indeed trapped in this situation. And that's very important in terms of the strategic autonomy of the European Union. But moving to the major question you asked us about the young people, how to encourage the question, the belief in the European Union. I remember always that it is said, as Jean Monnet once said in a talk he gave at the Sorbonne, that had he to start again producing the European Union, he would start with education and culture and not with the economy. It's fake. It has been invented probably by Mitterrand, but it's important because just as well, had he started with culture and education, not with the economy, the European Union probably would have never existed. It has been built on interest, not on generosity, following, as we know, the functional model. The economy will pull politics, and politics will pull, in turn, culture. Well, this has been working for a while, but I think we have reached the point that with the functional model no longer works. If we have a single currency, we need a share politics, we need a treasury, we need a budget, we need fiscality, common fiscal rules, something that is presently quite impossible in a society divided into 20-something different demoy communities or nations. The Germans' Karlsruhe ruling mentioned before, I think it's a very important question. It's kind of a legal exit by Germany that that shows that German demos, the population, the German population, will not submit to a potential European one. No? So building a European demos, I think, and working on a European culture is becoming a very, very urgent task. How to do that? Well, it's not easy, certainly. Let me mention a few tools that could be used for that extremely important endeavor. First, education, obviously, education. Erasmus has done more to create a European demos than any other program. We must be able to produce, in this context, a history of Europe as a compulsory course in secondary school. Young people should start to see themselves as citizens of Europe, as indeed they are. No? It's amazing that we are perceived as such abroad, but not in Europe. I remember last time I went to the United States, people asked me if I was European, not if I was French or Spanish or Italian. So they see us as Europeans. The European identity is perceived abroad, but unfortunately not in Europe. Second tool, evidently a European labor market. The movement of workers, especially those in the service sector, should be encouraged. The single market leaves much to be desired, has been said before, and is vulnerable to all sorts of asymmetric shocks. We must produce a much stronger European labor market. This will probably be the most efficient welfare system for European countries at the same time. No? Third, politics, European elections must be truly European and not national, at least with pan-European lists and an elected Commission president, someone that represents Europe, the European demos, the Europe as a whole. And probably four tool, I don't know, this is much more complicated, communication, media, a European TV, a news agency, being able to create a European public space and agora to confront the populist Europhobic narrative that you mentioned before. I'm sure there are other instruments, but these are the 3-4 major that I have been able to devise for this debate. Thank you.
Oh, just 2 minutes, but we have the very last question for Mr. Cheney, because the audience is very interested in that. No? Coming back to the leadership of the EU in the fight against climate change, we have to take important steps in the near future. First, the eventual imposition of a carbon tax in the EU borders. Second, a correct carbon pricing policy at the EU level. No? How do you see the prospects? No?
Sorry, I was on mute. So I will follow up on Guntram Wolf's steps when he mentioned that if we assume that Joe Biden wins the US election, then it might be a bit difficult to mix the Green Deal with the projects of Joe Biden's team. So what I would say is that there is an opportunity for Europe maybe to rethink the Green Deal and to move towards what I would call a carbon price policy with a border tax adjustment and open negotiations with the US. I will not be too long on that, but let me first say that Europe is a small player in the global carbon market. If you take a consumption-based measure, Europe is emitting consumption-based, not production-based, only 12% of global emissions. So we have to think our climate change policy not from a local level, but from a global perspective. The Green Deal, it's a lot of money spent to accelerate technological changes. So that is good. But in my view, that was a second, if not a third best. A carbon price policy on which each country would have to agree, which of course is not easy, together with a carbon price adjustment, so a border, adjustment, that makes sense if there is a single carbon price, both on the domestic market and at the border. But if we move in this direction, which raises a lot of issues, having countries agreeing on a common price, articulating the exchange trading system with a carbon price. But if we move in this direction, then we can open negotiations with the US. Let me remind you that in Joe Biden's platform, there was a carbon pricing policy and the border tax adjustment which comes with it. So if we move together in the same direction, then we can open negotiation, maybe with different carbon prices, in which case there would be a differential in the border tax adjustment on a bilateral basis, but we would move forward. And if we manage to do that during the next mandate of the US president, that would change the world, because China would have a very strong interest to join in what William Nordhaus had invented, the Nordhaus Club. So a club of countries which is practicing a carbon price policy, maybe not exactly the same price, but at least moving in this direction. So I think we have an opportunity, if we think of it, to recast the Green Deal to be more aligned with the US carbon price policy. And if we do that properly, we change the world.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, it's time to end. We don't have more time to continue enjoying this illuminating discussion on Europe. No, thank you very much. No, your contributions, supported by your experience and knowledge, has given us a better understanding of the future of the European economy. Thank you. We would like again to express you our gratitude for having accepted the invitation of the Círculo de Empresarios and the Rafael del Pino Foundation. We know the special effort that you have made to be here with us today in this virtual version of the forum. We hope that in the future it will be possible to meet in person in Spain.